and maybe even viewers, if you're watching on YouTube. I've got another amazing guest in today's Arcade Attack show. I've got a true Atari legend, someone who has been, well, he's got the title of maybe creating the first ever FPS game in Battlezone. We can talk about that later, but I've got Edward Rotberg here, a real legend. So thank you, Ed, for your time today.
No problem.
Thank you. I've got loads of questions about your career and what you've been up to, and firstly, appreciate you coming on today. Another huge Atari legend. I'd love to know first, Ed, though, is how did you get the opportunity to first enter the video game industry? Was it something you're always interested in? Did you make games before you got your big break, or how did that come about?
I was actually working at the time in Chicago when I first started down this path for a company called GD Cyril Pharmaceuticals. You might know them. They're the ones that came up with the aspartame sweetener that's non-sugar. Hold on a second. My wife just sent the dog up here, and he was looking to get out, so I may have to jump at any minute.
Want me to start again, or are you all right?
No, we're good. So I was working there, and I was in the lab, working in the lab section, interfacing lab equipment to microcomputers for real-time data collection, and so a friend of mine who was working in another department there, a gal that I used to go out with, brought me a copy of Info World magazine. This was an industry, programming rag back then, and said, "This looks like your perfect job, Ed," because I've always been a big gamer. I'd been programming the Xerox 7 there at Cyril to play Mastermind and a few other games and things like that. And so I said, well, let's check this out. So I sent a resume in, and the next thing I know, I got a call from a gentleman named Steve Calfee, who was the manager of the software group in the arcade group at Atari at that point. And we had a nice phone interview, and then he flew out to Chicago, and that was an interesting interview in and of itself. I guess, and no surprise, I was not the only person in the Chicago area that he was interviewing for the job. So he was holding interviews at his hotel room at the airport, O'Hare Airport, which is, well outside the city, shall we say. And I remember going to that interview, and you interview for a job back in those days, and you wore a suit and tie. I, get his hotel room, get up into his room, knock on the door, give me just a second to let the dog out of the room.
No problem.
Who let the dog out? Me. Go on. So I'm trying to, this room here is somewhat free of smoke, so I'm keeping the door closed. Anyhow, he answers the door, and he's wearing, like a golf shirt and shorts. And I go, first thing I said to him, and I think this is why I got the job, was I said, "Oh, thank God," and I took my tie off and my jacket off and threw it on the bed, and then we had a nice chat for an hour.
Nice. I know it's not related at all, but what's your dog's name out of interest? I know our viewers are probably interested.
It's Bogart, but we call him Bogey.
All right, okay. And I don't. And you said about smoke. You're currently based in, is it California? And unfortunately, you got some wildfires, haven't you?
We live in the old gold mining area of California. We're not in the Bay Area anymore. We moved out of the Bay Area about 21 years ago, and moved up here to get away from all the craziness and mayhem down there. Living in a very small town that we adore, but anybody who thinks who has lived up here for that long knows that climate change is real, and we have idiots in Congress. But that's no news, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, because you see there's no smoke in the room. I don't want anyone thinking your house is on fire or anything.
No. You wouldn't even see the smoke, but it's you can't miss the smell.
Right, fair enough. All right, back to Atari then. I love Atari. I have to say, I'm a massive Atari Jaguar fan. That's how my main love for the company, believe it or not. But I iconic company. How would you describe working at Atari during the 80s? Did you work closely with Nolan Bushnell, for example? Did you make some really good friends? And how would you describe the atmosphere at one of the most iconic video game companies of all time?
That's a really good question, and it's a really easy answer. It was the finest group of engineers and creative people that I've ever worked with in one singular group. I mean, I've worked with very special people over the years at different times, but for having a group of talented people all in one place, all working together, yes, we all became close friends. We not only worked together, we played together. You know, if someone was moving, then everybody, from the office chipped in and went over and helped him move, so, one guy, Rich Moore, the kind of crazy stuff we did. One guy, Rich Moore, was getting married, and we all decided that they're going to, get him what you want. He's going to return it, and get what he wants anyhow. And we said, well, maybe we should all buy him the exact same thing. So we all went to Macy's, which is a big department store here, and we all bought him the exact same toaster. So he got like 25 of this toaster, and he had to take back to Macy's 25 toasters to return them to get something. It was just a way of giving him a gift certificate, but we couldn't just give him gift certificates, I guess.
That is great. That is great. And are you still friends? I think you showed obviously people can't see this, but that you showed a really good picture on Twitter of you and some ex-colleagues at Atari, and it's the reason I got in contact with you, actually, thinking, wow, what a legend. And are you still in contact with any of these ex-colleagues today then?
A surprising number of them. For example, in that picture, both Owen and Ed Log and I, and I'm trying to remember who all else was in that picture, Owen and Ed Log and I are in regular contact. Wendy, I speak to very rarely. Al, I speak to him a bit more often. And same with Mike Alba. We stay in touch, but not close touch with them. But the other guys, yeah, we're like, in fact, Ed offered to put my wife and I and our dog up at his place in San Jose if we get evacuated from here again this year.
Wow.
And I run a golf tournament. I've been running it for, I don't know, over 25 years. And it's basically just a fun thing for guys. It started out for guys in the games business.
Oh, nice.
So we've been doing it for 25 years. So a lot of these same guys, I mean, they're really close friends. We go to spring training for baseball, some of us together. And yeah, this has been, like I said, it was a very, very special group, and we stay in touch.
No, good stuff. I've got to ask, was Battlezone the first game you worked on at Atari, or was there a game before Battlezone?
There was a game before Battlezone was my second game.
Right. What was the first game, Ed, if you don't mind me asking?
When I came to work at Atari, the game that was really hot in the arcades from Atari was a game that Ed Log did. The dog wants in again. I'm going to leave the door open, but it'll let some smoke in here. You won't see it. Hold on. Crazy dog. Was a game I did called, the game that was hot was a game called Football that Ed Log did. American football. It was on a big tabletop with two big track balls, not the little ones, but the old big ones. And they wanted to repurpose that cabinet and do a baseball game. So, I was just learning all this stuff and everything like that. And it took about 3 months, and we came out with a baseball game. So it did just okay.
Yeah.
Nearly as well as the football game.
Yeah, you're finding your feet still and getting.
And it needed to be done. Unfortunately, the arcade business has this thing called a production line, and if they can't keep it fed with product, then they're paying a lot of people to sit on their butts. So sometimes, the deadlines become really important, and they needed this one quick. So that's just the nature of the business as well.
No, that's fair enough. Obviously, Battlezone is probably one of your most well-known games that you worked on. Really iconic title. How did it come about? Was it your idea, Battlezone? It's a very interesting idea. It's 3D. people that don't know, it's 3D kind of FPS shooter, ahead of its time, personally, I think. But how did it come about for you?
Well, that's a good question, and I would love to take credit for the concept for Battlezone, but I can't.
Right.
It came out of one of the company would hold these brainstorming sessions where they would solicit ideas from everybody in the department. You can write up an idea. It can be like a paragraph. You can go, get some artwork if you can find someone to do drawing, or you were talented enough yourself to add, for screen representations of what you were thinking and things like that. And then they would take a select number of, the more senior staff and stuff and go off to an off-site meeting and go through all the ideas, vote on them, whittle it down, and come back with a book of approved game ideas. Mm-hmm. And that was going on just as I was finishing up Battlezone, the off-site for that, not Battlezone baseball, as I was finishing baseball, the off-site for that. So when they came back and I was ready for a new game, I was one of the first people to get a crack at that brainstorming sessions things, and there was a first-person 3D, tank game. And Atari had done a bunch of tank games that were really successful. They did the original tank game, and then Tank 8, which was this giant tabletop thing where you could have up to 8 people driving tanks around and shooting them. And we had also just come up with Howard Dellman had developed the vector display. The idea of being able to do 3D, which at that time was like a pipe dream, there had been talk about coming up with, a special process, creating a special processor from components to do nothing but 3D math. So that was the task set before. So there were a lot of new things that had to go on for that game to, even be possible to think about. So that's where the idea came from.
I mean, just the 3D element of it, the FPS element, it was a groundbreaking game. Did you know at the time that it was something quite special, or for you, is it just another project, or was it always like, wow, this could be pretty big?
It was never just another project. And, we were still pretty young back then. And I don't know that we were thinking about, hey, this is going to be big, and, and we're going to get rich off of this or anything like that. It was like, this looks like it's going to be a blast to work on. This is something I want to do. I studied, 3D graphics as it was at that time in college. And I was very fortunate enough to study with one of the true, legends in image synthesis, Jim Blinn, who was a graduate student at the University of Michigan when I was there. I got my initial dose of 3D graphics from, as well as doing vector graphics from him, in fact. So it was like, this would be a really fun thing to work on. I want to do this. So that's basically what it came down to. It wasn't quite, I didn't get to pick it out. Let me rephrase that. The project leader for that game was a gentleman named Morgenhoff. And he was, so as a project leader, he got to pick the game. He wanted to do that game, and he asked around, and I was like, yeah, I want to work on that. So I wasn't the one who went to the book and said, let's do this game. It was Morgenhoff, once he found someone who was excited, a programmer who was excited as he was to do the game.
But you programmed it from start to finish, is that right, Ed? It was your...
There were 2 parts I didn't program. I did not do the math box. That was done by Mike Alba, who was in that picture. He did that on a custom-built processor made out of 2901 bit slice processors. Right. So he was basically doing the matrix transform math on that. The other programmer who did a wee portion of it was Owen Rubin, who was also in that picture I posted, strangely enough. And Owen and I shared a lab during the development of Battlezone. And at one point, I had a lot of that stuff in and working, and the volcano was in there along with all the other window dressing around there. And every morning, Owen would come in and say, well, not morning, Owen was more of a vampire. He would come in every day around noon or so. He'd come in and said, "Did you get that volcano active yet?" And at first it was, yeah. And then after about the second month of him saying that, I finally said, "If you want that volcano active, you can write the code for it." So 2 days later, I've got this listing on my desk, and so he wrote the code to make the volcano active.
Oh, fair enough. But Ed, you did loads of the majority of it. What was the development like on it? Was it easy to produce? Was it really quite, with this new sort of 3D technology, was it quite troublesome? Was it how long did it take to make, for example?
Oh boy, that was closer to a year, and I honestly don't remember the duration. There were a lot of things involved. This was, this vector display was a new thing, and the way you programmed it, you kind of dynamically programmed it. So the game ran basically on a 6502 processor, and you used that to create the instruction set for one frame of video. And you divided, and the vector generator was like a state machine, so it was executing vector generator instructions. Mm-hmm. So you would divide the memory, I'm getting technical here, you would divide the memory of the instruction space of the vector generator in half with a jump statement at the top as to which half to do. You would create the frame for the vector generator to run for one full frame, and then you would switch the buffer to point to that section while you went and wrote the next frame's worth of data in the other half of the buffer. And so that's how you affected the whole thing. Of course, a lot of the debugging you would end up doing would be in the vector generator, which had really no tools for it. So one of the tools I had to write as part of that was a vector generator disassembler. So you could look at what you had written. So there were a lot of things involved in writing that. I had to write now if you go out and you want to write a 3D game, you would get a 3D engine like the Unreal Engine or Unity, and it has all the bases for doing that. It has a definition for an object, and you can go to. I had to do what the equivalent of all that was. But it was much simpler. It wasn't as involved. It didn't do all that. Yeah. Draw a bunch of lines. I'm not talking, but I had to create all that from scratch. There was nothing. A lot of programming, video games or anything else, is copying code from other things that people have done that worked. But for that game, there wasn't anything to copy from. So we were doing a lot of this from scratch.
I was going to ask, I think it is the first FPS, but do you know for a fact if it is? It sounds like there was nothing to base it on. So are you happy do you agree with that statement?
In some ways, yes. There was a game, and I will never, forget this, because I was working on this, we're going to have the first 3D game come out, and Cinematronics also had a vector display. Right. And shortly before Battlezone came out, the incomparable and sadly departed Tim Skelly from at that time at Cinematronic released a game called Tail Gunner. And Tail Gunner was 3D. You couldn't control, you were on a rail. So you were the tail gunner. You just had things show up. So, you could point the gun and shoot at things, but you couldn't move around in this world. So it was kind of halfway there.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
If you remember Tail Gunner, which, boy, Tim was, I don't know, he might have been one of the most creative people I knew in that industry. And if you look at the breadth of things he did over his years, both in video games and, he had Comic Chat was just a groundbreaking thing that was ahead of its time. I was fortunate enough to work with Tim later on with Seamus Blackley and Innovative Leisure. A true gentleman in addition to being a genius.
Oh, fair enough. Oh, that's very, very gracious of you. But yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. I've got to ask, actually, because obviously Battlezone was a huge success, amazing success for Atari. But it also got the US Army talking. I need to know what. Obviously, I live in the UK. I don't know too much about this story, but I've done a little bit of. It's just absolutely incredible. How did the US Army get involved with you and Battlezone, Ed? If you don't want me asking.
There were a group of, well, it's not a subject I particularly am fond of, but well, for the record here, there were a group of retired generals that wanted to propose using video game technology to train soldiers as a concept. And of course, Battlezone had just come out, and they got together with a gentleman at Atari, a gentleman named Rick Moncrief, who is a friend, and they proposed to him doing a game that could be used to train, and I don't know how they came up with this particular idea, the gunner station for a new infantry fighting vehicle that one of our, military industrial complex companies had created, called the infantry fighting vehicle, the Bradley fighting vehicle. And they wanted to create this thing called the Bradley Trainer, based around the capabilities of, what Battlezone had done.
Right.
So they proposed this to Rick. There was going to be a meeting of the actual U.S. military training, it's called TRADOC, I think. And they wanted to have a prototype to show them in about 3 months.
Right.
So Rick proposed this to Atari, and Atari said, "Hey, yeah, let's do this." And I said, "Oh, no, this is a bad idea."
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. 3 months is just too short to do the kind of things they were talking about. I had previously worked at a company that contracted to the military Texas Instruments, it was, I don't think it had expired by then, but I had a secret clearance. I saw the kinds of things when you contract to the military, all of a sudden there are new rules for your company, all up and down the board if you're working with the U.S. government. So I didn't want to see Atari go through that. I didn't, I loved where I was working. So I made, there was no one else who could do this in the time frame that they were talking about. So I struck a deal that said that if I do this prototype, I can wash my hands of any future military projects. I'm basically a pacifist. I'm not a gung-ho, military guy. So for 3 months of my life, I basically lived at Atari. I would get up in the morning, get to work. I'd work typically anywhere from 14 to 18-hour days. I would go home, I would kiss my wife goodnight and go to sleep and wake up and start all over again. There were no weekends. And everybody knew this was going to be a crash and burn thing. I was done for, a good, 2 weeks at least after this thing went out the door.
Yeah.
And, managed to get it done by deadline. And it was not a fond memory of my life experience.
Yeah, I don't mean to bring up sorry, Ed. I don't think obviously.
At this point, I'm just saying it's not something I look back with fondness on. It doesn't hurt. It's okay.
Would you class it as it's not a game though, is it? Then it's a simulator maybe. Or?
We awarded points. They wanted they wanted the players to have competition, be able to say hey, I'm the best one here. So the other guys would work harder and train. So we did award points and make it into sort of a game. But the game was basically quickly identify friendly from foe, because we had friendly vehicles out roaming the playfield too, and then take down the foe as quickly as possible, because that's what they wanted to do. Familiarize yourself with the controls, blah 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 blah. And that's what the purpose of the game they wanted to eventually produce was. This was just a prototype. So the game was very primitive. You kill a bad guy, you get a certain number of points depending on, whether it was a helicopter or a jeep or a tank or whatever. You blow up a good guy, you lose a bunch of points. So it wasn't much of a game.
Was it ever released to the public, or is it very?
To my knowledge, there were only 2 prototypes ever made.
I bet they're worth a pretty penny.
I don't know. I think Scott Evans has one. I'm not positive. and I think he rescued it out of a dumpster.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not like this was a revered piece of history when we finished with it.
No.
When they decided not to go through, Atari decided not to go through with, following through on this, it was an oddity. It was like another prototype that the game didn't pan out. So
it's bizarre. It's just bizarre. I mean, it sounds like it took a toll on you a little bit. And
yeah, at the time, we weren't thinking about this, that, these boxes are pieces of history. We just didn't think of it that way.
Yeah. There's a question here, but I'm sort of jumping a bit ahead, Ed. But if I can ask now from John Painter from Twitter, the Bradley Trainer. That's what it's called, the Bradley Trainer. I mean, this is quite a tough question, but you don't have to answer this. But he says, how does Ed feel now in the 21st century, where we have conditioned our young to be ready for war in the comfort of their own bedrooms, and even given them Call of Duty style HUD for use in combat? So do you have an opinion about that sort of thing, or is that?
It's something I don't give a lot of thought to be honest with you. It's not something that makes me proud to have been on the forefront of creating entertainment that trains people for war, because I'm a pacifist. And so it's a little bit disquieting. On the other hand, it was going to go this way, one way or the other.
I appreciate.
I'm not going to condemn it. I'm not going to praise it. I just, it is what it is.
No, I appreciate you answering. And I guess it sounds like a movie script, part of this. And if I'm being honest, because there were some movies at the time, but I think it was what's it called, the Flight of the Navigator. They're training kids to play arcades and the armies. I don't know if you saw that.
There's a number of movies like that. There's Ernie Klein wrote Armada.
Yes. And that's a very good book, to be fair. I don't know if you.
Oh yeah, Ernie is he's a wonderful guy.
Ready player. Have you met Ernie? Yeah? Okay.
Only over the internet. We've gone back and forth quite a bit. I'm a huge fan of his. That's for sure. Ready
Player 1 is, and Ready Player 2 as well. I don't know if you've read.
Yeah. I've got signed. You see behind me a large bookcase. I've been collecting science fiction and fantasy books for years and years, and I've got all three of his as signed first editions, and nice. A couple of them came directly from Ernie, so I'm very proud of those books.
Were you mentioned in any of those books? I know he mentioned a few Atari legends. I don't know if your name cropped up in any of them at all, or I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if my name did, but Battlezone certainly did.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure that came up, didn't it? It's my last question, is Ed, but there's some people kind of link the work for the US Army to Polybius, that crazy arcade game, that myth. It doesn't exist, obviously, but it's an unbelievable urban legend. I mean, have you heard those kind of links before? Is that just ridiculous in your eyes?
I've heard all of the legends. I have denied involvement for years and years, and guys like Mike will just oh sure, Ed, I'm the devious sort of guy that's going to try to reprogram someone's brain to have a nervous breakdown. I'm not that smart.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating myth, but that's all it is, really, isn't it? Just to
my son, who's now 40 years old, tells me that I shouldn't do anything to hurt my evil genius street cred, as he puts it.
Yeah, that seems pretty right in a way. You did Battlezone. You worked on this Bradley Trainer. Is it true you left Atari soon after this, Ed, and you started your own company, then came back again? Are you happy to sort of fill in the dots a little bit to our listeners?
Yeah. Shortly, before we left, I wouldn't say shortly, but maybe about a year or so before I left Atari with two other guys, Howard Delman, the inventor of our vector generator, and a gentleman named Roger Hector. Activision, the guys who created Activision left Atari and went off, and a lot of it, to be honest, had to do. This was before the developers, the designers and programmers and artists that created these games got a lot of money for successful games. The company got that money, and we got bonuses.
Right.
We had no say in how big those bonuses were and things like that. We got to divvy those bonuses up amongst our team, and we had a say in that, but not how much the team got. And it really wasn't all that much. And so we saw these guys from Activision doing the home stuff. This was, on 2600, go off and get very wealthy. And, the three of us said, why shouldn't we do the same thing in the arcade business end of things? We kind of knew what kind of money was going around, and we weren't seeing all that much of it.
Yeah.
So that was the reason behind it. It was, and I was, young, invulnerable. We all are at that age. So we went off and we formed a company that at the time was called Vidya.
Right.
We hired a few others of our friends who either had already left or were looking to leave. And we started creating games, selling ourselves back to the industry.
Clever. Yeah.
We did a couple of arcade games. One that really wasn't all that good. And then we were approached. We were approached by Nolan Bushnell. Had left the company a few years before, but with Atari was running out. And so he wanted to get back into the video game business. He was at that time doing a business called Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
But he wanted to get back into video games, and so he had an engineering group that was in developing all the animatronics and stuff like that. But they were not video people at all. So he said, "Hey, you guys, we have known Nolan for years, of course, working at Atari." And he said, "How would you guys like to be a part of, we'll buy your company?" And here we thought, "Oh, hey, we're going to get bought out. We're going to get rich quick." Of course, we got bought out with stock primarily from Pizza Time Theater. And, we were all excited, the stock was going to go up and blah, 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 blah. And well before we could get our first game even out the door, Pizza Time Theater kind of crumbled. And all that stock was worth nothing. So now we were working for a company that was going bankrupt, and our division was then sold to Bally, from Pizza Time Theater to Bally, and it was there that we created the. After we had been bought, Nolan renamed the company to Sente, which is the move after Atari in the game of Go. For those not familiar,
oh, is it?
His game of Go, yeah. So it was like, checkmate to the Czech of Atari.
Very clever.
The game. And so we created the interchangeable cartridge game, arcade game, and we started working on those games for Bally Sente. It was
right.
So that's how that whole thing went.
That's quite an interesting. Wow, that's a crazy few years. A couple of years, wasn't it? I bet.
Yeah.
I interviewed Rob Phillip quite recently, and he works at Atari, obviously, and he said for his year, for his bonus, he got a turkey, and that was kind of the thing that said, well, I don't want to be at Atari anymore. That obviously, at the time, I don't think they gave credits to people in the games. I don't know about the arcades, but you're talking about the Atari 2600 games, and he went on to make his own sort of company, or went off. I mean,
we weren't allowed to. They kept our names completely. They were trying to hide us. At one point, they allowed a writer, Michael Treitman from the Smithsonian Magazine, to come interview us during the big arcade boom and things like that. And he did an article, but he had to, sign papers up and down the wazoo that our names would be removed or, substituted or whatever. And so, the article came out and there's pictures and you can still find them on the web. But, all our names were removed. We certainly couldn't put them in the game. They did allow us to seed the high score table when you first power up the game. There's a bunch of initials and base high score table. Yeah. And we could have our initials in there, but that's it.
Right.
So yeah, we got no credits. We got no bonuses. It was pretty sad. So there was a change that happened certainly in the Koinak group in their bonus policy after Howie and Roger and I left. So that did instigate what I like to think of as a fairer, if not completely fair, because I don't know all the details, bonus plan than what it had been when I was there.
Right. I mean, you've seen it always.
When I was there the first time, because I did go back.
You went back, didn't you? And again, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but is it Blasteroids? That was another big game of yours.
That was the first game I did when I went back.
What was that like? Because Blasteroids, space shooter, what was your influence like? Was that your idea as well?
Well, I got back and I was like, all right, I'm going to get ready. I'm going to work on my first game. And I was, working on a bunch of different ideas. And I went to Dan Van Eldren, who was at that time the head of the engineering group. And I said, I have this great idea. And he said, sit down, Ed. We need a sequel to Asteroids.
Right.
And so then I crumpled up the paper I'd been working on, and I said, all right, well, let me see what I can, let me propose some ideas that would work with that. And so I took some of the ideas from the game. Primarily, I had like a rock, paper, scissors kind of element to the game that I added, which was the 3 different ships. And then, a co-op mode where you could combine 2 of the ships if you did it right. And so that's how the idea for Blasteroids came about.
What was the idea of the game crumpled up in that piece of paper, if you don't mind me asking?
I honestly don't remember. That's a long time ago, but the essential part that came out of that, I do remember lifting the rock, paper, scissors portion of the game that I had been working on out and patching it into an Asteroids theme.
And this was an arcade game still, is that right?
Yeah, that's all I ever did for Atari.
I wanted to ask, you never worked on the parts?
I did work on some stuff for the Atari home computer.
Right, okay.
I did work on in-store demos and a music synthesizer for the home computer, so yeah.
I was going to ask actually because just going back to my interview with Rob Phillip, he was working on Atari 2600 games, and he was saying it was always like, well, if you worked on the carts, you got arcade. Basically, the people that made the arcades, they had the power, they came up with the ideas, and then you had to sort of make that into the carts. Would you agree with that, or would you ever like to make your own sort of, Atari cartridge games, or?
I would agree with that to a large part. I mean, they weren't looking just to us; they were licensing other arcade games to do on the cartridges. That was a much bigger beast to feed, but of course, much less capable hardware to work on. So, they went and took a lot of the games that were successful in the arcade that we had done, and they ported them, because you already had your built-in marketing. Kids would go to the arcade and, play Battlezone. They'd want to come home and play Battlezone, even though it could never be the same experience on the 2600. So. Yeah,
that's fair enough. Yeah, I've got to ask about Rampart. I mean, it's one of my favourite games. I love it. I grew up playing that game on the Master System and the Amiga. I think it was the Amiga as well. Just so great. I just love the originality of it. It seemed quite different. I love the building elements, the strategy. It's like a puzzle game. What was your role on that game? Because I'd love to hear about this.
I can't take any credit. It's very interesting. John Solowitz and Dave Ralston were the 2 guys behind Rampart. And they're both very good friends. They come to the golf tournament every year. John and I go to, and sometimes Dave, our families go to spring training together every year. We stay in touch. We try to do things together. But I was over at John's house one night, and he pulls out this board game called Castles.
Right.
And he sits down, and he and Dave start. He says, "I think there's an arcade game in here." And he and Dave start working, and I'd make a comment here and there. And for some reason, this happens a lot in video games. if you contribute anything, they'll throw your name on it. I contributed playing the game. And I contributed maybe a little bit, although I honestly cannot recall. It was just looking back on it, an honor. At the time, it was a blast to be sitting around Dave and John as they came up with the idea for Rampart. And I remember John going, "It's got to be Rampart, not Ramparts." It's a Rampart. There aren't Ramparts.
You like the game, I take it. You're a fan of it.
Oh God, yeah.
It's so fun, isn't it? It is so fun. Okay, that's so interesting hearing about how you saw the game just developed. Yeah, that's crazy.
Well, you got to remember, for all the arcade games, and this actually was encouraged on my second tour through Atari. There were formal Walkabout Fridays where you were, encouraged to walk about and play all of the prototype, all the games that other people were working about. And there was a, sheet there. You could give feedback. I love this and I hated this, and this is unfair. And for the games you were working on, it was quite often wonderful to look at the, this is unfair, and all right.
Can you remember any games that you thought, wow, this is amazing, and you before it was released, or any games you thought, oh, I'm not so sure, and actually maybe became a really big seller? Or
well, I became just maybe the biggest fan ever of Cyberball. That was an American football game with robots, if you will, and it was set up. The original version was a up to 4-player cabinet with 2 teams with 2 monitors sitting like at well, from your direction it would be like this, a monitor in each direction, so you could kind of glance over at your friends while you were playing, but not see their screen. So you each had privacy of screen, and you were competing against each other. So while you were calling the offensive plays, they were calling the defensive plays. So you didn't want to see what plays they were calling. And so that's why they were angled so that you couldn't see the screens.
That's clever.
And there was a mirror in the middle, so you could, like, while you're doing, you could glance up and see the eyes of the other guy too.
That's great. Little things like that, Ed, I'm sure you agree, just make the difference. Unbelievable.
A funny story regarding that: we're never the best players of the games we write. Right. We may think we are. We may get really good in the lab, and no one's going to come challenge us because we're the best. And John Solwitz and I got pretty good as a team, playing Cyberball, and we decided to go into an arcade one night and school the arcade players in there, and it was not a good idea.
I actually, that reminds me, I remember asking John Tobias, obviously Mortal Kombat legend, whether he liked to sort of just go into arcades and watch people play his games and hear what they had to say. And did you ever do that with Battlezone and other games you worked on? I know you said you played a few.
Yes, you do. And some of the things they said, made your heart swell. Some of the things they would say, especially right after the game was released or while it was on field test, because we would put games out, in the arcades before they were fully finished to see if they were on the right track. What do they like? What do they don't like? So we actually had to go do watch people play our games as part of the whole thing. We wouldn't say, hey, I'm the designer. We would just sit back and observe candidly.
No, it must be really interesting. Ed, I think before you left Atari, you worked on Stilled Talons. Is that one of your last games that you worked on?
Not one of my last games, but yeah. Well, I guess it had one of my last games, but it was one of the games I worked on my second stint at Atari. And the best part about that was working with Ed Log. I mean, I still think of him as maybe one of the two or three all-time greatest arcade game designers of all time. And he is just an amazing person. Love Ed Log. He's just the best. Legend, of course. Why did you leave Atari again, if you don't mind me asking? Was there another reason, or did you have another offer to come your way? Or? The second time, it wasn't, because they weren't paying me enough or anything like that. It was a little bit. It actually involved corporate politics.
Right.
there was one gentleman who was, I love your cat's tail.
I know, sorry.
No, sorry. There was one gentleman who was in the, design, arcade group, and I'm not going to mention any names, but when they were doing reorganizations, they decided to put him into management.
Right.
And a number of us felt at the time that this was a bad idea because, we felt like, for the other project leaders, well, if his project needed resources and he was on the committee that would assign those resources, that wasn't an entirely lacking conflict of interest. And they went, no, this is never going to happen, whatever. And at the time, there was a project being, I guess I was finishing up on Steel Talons. And there was a project that was just being spun up as like a far-flung, this may pan into something in the future. And it was like, a virtual place because the internet was becoming something that, maybe we can leverage for video games at this point. And maybe we can get a place where players could come together and walk into different rooms together virtually to play a game together in that room kind of thing, far-flung ideas back then. And I was scheduled to go work on that with a guy named Rusty Daw. I got pulled off of going to work on that project to work on this gentleman who was now both a project leader and part of management on his game. And well, it would have been one thing to work on his game, actually doing coding or design or the game, but he ended up using me as basically his data entry clerk. And he would, I wrote one section of the game that did the parallax floor of a game called Guardians of the Hood, so that it would look like it was moving properly. And so I wrote that, and he goes, well, we're not done with the game. I got to enter all these individual moves for the players. So why don't you be my data? And basically, I was his data entry clerk, and he sat over my shoulder and told me what to type in. At that point, I said, you can't pay me enough money to do this crap. And so I had a friend who had gone off. Owen Rubin had already left the company. He was working at Apple.
Yeah.
He said, come to work for me. So I went to work. I didn't work for him, but I went to work at Apple for a few years. So,
did you? I saw my questions, but did you work when Steve Jobs was at Apple, or was it the in-between period, or do you remember? Or
I think Steve was still with the company at that time, or he was leaving the company at that time. Yeah, I was working on Macintosh computers, basically some. I did a few different things there. So yeah.
Yeah, just back to what you were saying before, and you don't have to say names, but it does sound a little bit, Ed, come on, you built up a huge reputation of amazing games, and all of a sudden, data entry. That's not really, on, right?
It was never called that. It was, hey, I have this resource. This resource is really good with a keyboard and terminal, because that's what it was at that point. We were typing things into a VAX 11780, I believe, through a VT100 terminal. Yeah. And, I was very good at that, but just because I did it all the time, not because, and it was, I guess he didn't realize how demeaning it was, or he didn't care, one or the other, but I did.
What do you think of Atari now? Because Atari is still around, but it's a bit of a shell of a company at the moment. I know they've got the new console coming out, but they've been some ups and downs. Do you feel a bit sad that the Atari you grew up with is not really there anymore?
Yeah, it's funny, for a few years there, and I guess it's faded now, but you'd see people, kids basically walking around with Atari shirts with the Atari logo, and they had no idea.
Yeah.
They probably didn't even realize what it represented, certainly to someone who lived through that experience. So in a way, it's sad. It's business.
Yeah.
It's what happens.
Yeah.
IP becomes a thing in and of itself, intellectual property, the use of a name. In some ways, I've seen that on a more personal level with all the variations of Battlezones that have come out since then, leveraging on the title of the game. But in many cases, these were excellent games. So I wasn't upset in the least about it because they were doing stuff I wish I could have done back then. So, it kind of works both ways.
Yeah, I meant to. Battlezone, you're right, has spawned quite a few different games and sequels, and you weren't involved in any of those. Is that true, or did you ever give any consultancy? Or
really involved in any of them, but the gents at Rebellion, great guy, Steve Bristow, the guy I talked to there. I hope to actually meet one day when we travel across the pond again. He decided that I'm going to tip my hat to the original Battlezone, and I'm include in the storyline that the reason you're out here fighting in this futuristic tank, and that's Battlezone VR I'm referring to specifically, is because you're fighting against an evil corporation. Let's call it the Rotberg Corporation.
That's brilliant.
And so he did that, and I had just seen that, because I see all this stuff from now and then. And I went when VR was announced. I went to their website and I saw, evil Rotberg Corporation, and I tweeted something out to the effect of, this is crazy. How did I become evil in all of this? But I guess I should worry. My son says it helps my evil street cred. So evil genius street cred. So I had tweeted this out, and then Steve must have seen that and contacted me, and he goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We thought this would be it." I would laugh back. I said it was pure lighthearted humor. And they said, "Can we use your name?" I said, "Oh, sure, but you need to send me a T-shirt and a copy of the game." And of course, as soon as the game came out, that all came forward. They were very upfront, and I signed something for me. Hey, you can use my name.
I've played it. It's a very good game, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's very good, isn't it? I played Battlezone VR.
Oh yeah. They did a really good job, and it's a really logical use of VR to be in a vehicle. I mean, you don't have to get up and walk around and run into things.
Oh, so good. I've got to talk about your time at 3DO because I find that fascinating. The console, the whole company, Trip Hawkins. What an amazing man. Why did you join 3DO? Did you know Trip, or how did you get the opportunity?
So I was at Apple at that time, and Apple went through this huge reorganization. I'd been there for a couple of years, and the group that I was with was dissolved. And so, they were laying off a lot of people. It was not just a reorganization. It was reorganization and a reduction in force. Now, a RIF, as we call it. And the people who were getting RIFed were, given these wonderful severance packages because Apple was always good to their employees. So they'd get like 6 months and, recommendations and, please go find another job,
Yeah.
So they didn't RIF me. It would have been wonderful. They said, no, we want you to stay with the company here. We're going to move you to this group. And they moved me to a group doing, now this was, before, ubiquitous internet service providers. This was back when you had dial-up modems. And or you had newfangled modems that, you just connected in line. And so they reorged me to a group doing modem technology, and I did graphics, man. I did, gameplay. I didn't know the first thing about, I didn't know the second thing about modems, and I didn't want to. And so that got me looking around for another job, and 3DO had some openings, so I applied. And
did you enjoy it at 3DO? What was it like working there?
Well, the first thing is that 3DO, every employee, whether they were, a person who was, involved with, changing out the toner cartridges and the printers or whatever, or they were, a director of a department, every employee had to interview with Trip at one point or another.
Right,
So sometimes they were group interviews and stuff like that. So I got to meet Trip and all this, and basically they brought me in to work as a liaison between the developers, the game developers community, and the hardware group, the internal, hardware and software group supporting the developers. And then he developed a studio inside to do internal titles. It wasn't originally going to be driven by internal titles that much, but they wanted to increase the content coming out. And so I was in this position. So the first thing I was doing some demos of how you could do like 3D on the original 3DO and stuff like that. And I was just getting going with that, and they decided they needed a software director for the internal games group. So quickly I got shifted into that role, and then they reorged, after a year or two, they reorged the game group so that it was in more I guess you would call it horizontally oriented, so that there were individual teams, and I was a director of a team within the game group. So cool. So that's how that whole thing went down.
And one of the games you worked on was Killing Time. Is that right, Ed?
Actually, that's not right. Moby Games has some information. There's some information that's not quite right, and a lot of information that's just missing. There's a ton of things that are not listed on there. And we could talk about those for ages, but John Haidt was responsible for Killing Time. He was the director of that group. I was in another group, and they had their programmers had just come from reporting to me, and so I had some minor involvement with Killing Time, but not really with the game. And if I got my name in the credits in that, and I honestly don't remember whether I did or not, that was just John Haidt being a gentleman, which he is. He's another really wonderful guy that this industry has allowed me to work with and know in the time. That's probably the best part about working in this industry. It's all the wonderful people I've had a chance to work with.
What games did you work on then at 3DO? Was there any big
Well, the first game I did was, Trip come and go, we have to have an edutainment title.
Right.
And we've got other teams. And he said, you need to do this for me. And he gave me the old pitch. So I did a game called Station Invasion, which did a lot of it. It mixed a cast of young kids who had taken over a TV studio on their own, and they had different shows, and you would use that as the mechanism to do different kinds of learning games.
Right,
So there was a large video production, we hired a video director and, giant green screen room and doing all this stuff. And then I had my own programming team and art team. And again, crazy deadline. There are funny stories involved with that whole thing, but, it's like all these. Every game you do has its own set of stories, believe me.
I bet it does.
That was the first game I did for 3DO, and then the M2 project came about, which was 3DO's next generation game that they had partnered with Panasonic or Matsushita to manufacture.
Yeah.
So I got to get the lead title on that, at least. It was a racing game, which was something much more up my alley to do.
Yeah.
Driving game,
Of course, yeah. What was the driving? What was it called?
I'm sorry, it was called. Originally it was going to be called IMSA Racing because we modeled the IMSA race cars and the tracks that they raced on. But it was eventually, because of licensing reasons, not being worked out. It was, I think, called World Championship Racing. You can find videos of some of the gameplay, but for its time. The graphic quality was really outstanding. There was no pop-up of things in the elements as you drove. Everything was on screen all the time. We were casting real shadows. If you went under a bridge, it was pixel accurate shadows rendered onto the cars as they went under the bridge. Stuff like that, specular reflections from the cars, that kind of thing.
Nice. Well, the 3DO is a great console, very powerful, but it never really, PlayStation destroyed it. You might agree or disagree, but
no.
Yeah, why
got their start with 3DO?
Yeah,
So yes, I agree with you. It failed badly in the war between the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was the loser in that battle.
And the Jaguar 64.
And the Jaguar, yeah, I had
Jaguar.
my buddy Rob Zadibble worked over on that for a while.
I've got a Jaguar. I'm a big fan actually. But yeah, that must have been an interesting battle. But unfortunately, for 3DO at least, I didn't quite win that battle. And was that the reason why you had to? Did you leave the company because of just the 3DO collapsing, or?
The racing game was a labor of love. I actually got to work with Mark Cerny on that. He did the actual kernel of the game. It wasn't a full game engine, but he did the kernel of the 3D engine, which was a brilliant feat of programming in and of itself. And the game was truly a labor of love. I mean, we poured a lot of stuff into this. And then when the platform flopped, I just said, I'm kind of done with this. At that point, I went off and I worked for Rick Moncrief, of all people, the guy who championed the Bradley trainer at Atari. And the guys I had hired, and I knew from Atari, who did race driving and hard driving, they were doing a location-based entertainment project, which eventually got called Silicon Motor Speedway. But they'd go into like shopping malls and different locations and put anywhere from like 8 to, I think the biggest one had like either 12 or 14 of these 7A size NASCARs sitting in front of 3 projection screen monitors with a rear view monitor and an information monitor in the cockpit. They were motion platforms with force feedback steering, and you race upon accurately modeled NASCAR tracks with real physics engines that were like, each module had like 4 Pentium processors, which was state of the art at the time, driving this, and you'd compete with the other players.
So cool.
And it was a very cool thing. So I went and worked on that, and basically worked on the rendering engine with Terry Farnham, it was with Max Vensky and Stephanie Mott and Rick Moncrief and all those guys. So I did that for a few years.
Nice. Good on you. Incredible career. Just a few sort of, short fire questions and a few social media questions, if that's all right, Ed. Did you, I know you kind of mentioned earlier, but did you ever start work on any unreleased games in your career? And if so, which one did you feel would have been the most successful if you completed it?
Well, that would be the last game I worked on for Innovative Leisure. So and it was never released. It was a game called Draconis Rex. It was out on test for a while in Australia only. I have very fond memories of that. Also, the 3DO racing, the championship racing game that never went out.
Yeah. Why didn't that come out on the 3DO?
Because the platform failed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It was written for the M2 platform, and the platform never made it to market. So that game didn't come out. And those things kill you. Sometimes they don't if it's really a crappy game. Hey, that wasn't a good idea. Okay, because I had some of those too. But there, was a game. There were some games that I worked on. I was working on 2 games when I left Atari. The second time. Was the second time? No, the first time I left. There were 2 games I was working on, and one was eventually went on to become Star Wars. I had been working on a game before they got the license, and it was called Warp Speed, and it was going to be a space fighting game. And I said, we have to use the Bradley Trainer controller because this makes sense for a video game. So we used a slightly modified version of the controller that went into the Bradley Trainer, and we had 2 stations that could, pilot a spaceship around in space. Well, we quickly learned that it was very easy to get disoriented and not have any idea where you're facing in true 3D space. Even with kind of a radar telling you, it was the game morphed into Star Wars, which made way more sense. So that was a game that I never finished. But another game that I had started on, I wanted to do a game based on Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern.
Right, and never heard of it.
It was a series of books. And so we got going on that game, and there's some stories involved with all of that. I came up with a concept for moving a snake around on a bitmap display, where you could move a bunch of little snakes real quickly if they were just 1 pixel, by just erasing not redrawing the whole screen, but erasing the tail and moving the head forward. And so you would just have a real quick algorithm to do this. And then I did all kind of modifications. And so that was going to be the thread which fell from the sky in the Dragon Riders of Pern thing, which the Dragon Riders used to blast out of the air with their fiery breath, because if the thread fell, all kinds of bad things happened. So that was what the game was based on. After I left, Peter Lipson finished a game called Fire Beast, which was based on that, because they never could agree with McCaffrey on the license. And I took that same algorithm, and it became the basis for a game that Sente did called Snake Pit, which was a takeoff on Indiana Jones, the original Indiana Jones movie, and snakes, how he hated snakes.
Yeah.
So, and then the funny part about that was when my son first got into college, he was a computer engineering student. His first course, they were teaching them how to write Java, and the example that the homework that the instructor gave, I was with my son in his class on parent-teacher day, and I wanted to sit in on this class, and he gives them the problem of moving a snake around on the screen, and I just cracked up. I had to leave the class because I was laughing so hard. And Gabe knew what was going on. My son Gabe knew what was going on.
You could have run that class, couldn't you?
That he picked that example out of all the things to give them as an exercise in the class was great. So, yeah.
That is funny. Just really back to your race again. Could that not have been released on the PlayStation? Could you not have used a lot of the graphics and the
No, the PlayStation wasn't capable of rendering that. I mean, it could have been released. I don't know that the PlayStation had the power to do both the physics engine, because we actually used real physics in that game, and it certainly couldn't do graphics at the level that the M2 could. It was a great machine, but it was never meant to be a 3D monster, and the M2 was.
The M2 was fully produced in this hardware. It was available, yes, but it just wasn't released. It just Correct. There are prototypes out there.
You can probably find more information about that on the net. One of the guys on the team, Alex Werner, I think, had one of the prototypes after the whole thing went away. For at least for a number of years. I have not been in touch with Alex. I don't know if he still has it or what. Really, really brilliant guy, Alex.
It's a shame, really, isn't it? Because I guess we'll never know, but maybe that could have been the console that did rival the PlayStation brand, and we'll never know, I guess, now. But.
Yeah, and like I said, there's fun stories about all these games, and I have one about that was kind of interesting. So yeah, like any one of us who were in the industry long enough can regale you with lots of stories about different things. Trust me.
What a legend. What are you currently working in the video game industry? What projects are you currently working on right now? Are you retired or?
I am retired.
Yeah.
One of the smartest things I did in my life was marry my wife, who happened to be a financial advisor, which is actually how we met. And so, while I was slaving away on video games all these years, she was working to make other people, wealthy, and for us as well. So I was able to retire a few years ago, and it's nice not to have a deadline hanging over my head anymore. So now I I do photography. You know, I raise a dog. I play golf when I can. Well, I don't know if people watching would call it golf, but I go out on the golf course and I swing clubs and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, good. So you're enjoying life. I think you deserve it after your long career, definitely. Do you still play games though? Have you got any favourite video games you play today?
I do. I don't play the Twitch games anymore. I can't. I'm a septuagenarian now, so the hands don't work quite as fast as they used to, and it just gets frustrating for me. I kind of like more enjoy the good turn-based RPGs, and the game I've had most fun recently with is this RPG with shall we just say more fanciful rather than photorealistic graphics, called For the King, if you must know.
I've heard of this. Yeah.
Part of the reason I like it is it's crossed almost every platform you can shake a stick at, and it has a 3-player cooperation mode, and so I play with my son and his wife, who are both big-time gamers.
Nice.
Although more board gaming and role-playing games than video games, but big-time video game players too. And so we've been playing it once a week. We get online and play for like 3 hours at a stretch.
Oh, nice.
And it was, and we're using Discord, and so we just have a fun time doing that. And since they live across the country from me and I rarely get to see them, it was just a wonderful way to connect for a few hours with them every week. So
good on you. For the King, yeah, definitely have to check it out. Before I say goodbye, Ed, I've got a few last quick fire social media questions from Micah. Another legend in the industry.
I'm not sure whether it's Micah or Mika.
Yeah, I've definitely said one of it wrong at least. We've asked question 2. I've already asked you about the Polybius question. How long does it take to reach the outer edge of the volcano in Battlezone? Have you?
Very, 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 very long time, because it doesn't exist. It's just a drawing out there. The playfield itself wraps within its own, I think it's 1024 by 1024 unit size. That's already over 40 years ago. So I can't tell you if it was 1024 or 2048, but it wraps within its own coordinate system in both the X and the Z direction, if you will.
Oh, fair enough.
So you know your 3D graphics.
I don't know what this question means. I'm going to ask anyway. What does the keyhole do on the back of the hut in hard driving? Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense to me. There was a place you could drive to. There was a test track. That was if you got off the regular track in I think it was race driving. There was a skid pad you could go, test and see, how fast you could go before you lost traction fully. That's because they were trying to do as real a physics model as they could. And my answer is I don't know. I knew it was there, and it was one of those things I never ever asked Max or Steph about, and they would be the ones who would know.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. CDI Arcade asks, kind of asked this already, but it says, I wonder if devs for games like Battlezone were thinking about the Atari 2600's limits, if there was going to be a port, or if they were more free to experiment because of arcade hardware could change with every game.
Well, I would let me answer it this way. If we had seen 1 penny from the revenues of games that were ported to the 2600, we would have been thinking about it for sure.
Good answer.
As it was, as I said, we were working on these things because we loved the game. We loved the concept. We were thinking about doing just the best damn game we could. Not a thought went into, are they going to have a hard time porting this? No, not a single thought.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I don't blame you, really, if I'm being honest. Another question from Grail. They ask, at what point during its development did the arcade cabinet get the iconic periscope? What did you wish you could have added to the game?
Well, this is going to upset a lot of people, but I hated that periscope.
Wow.
And I'll explain why. To answer the question, it was with the first concepts that were drawn up for the cabinet. The project leader, Morgan Hoff, wanted to have this periscope.
Yeah.
And in the original version, later versions had a window cut out alongside so people could see in.
Yeah.
I hated it because the arcade experience back in those days was you'd walk around the arcade thinking, oh, I'm going to try this game, or oh, I'm going to try this game. And because you were watching other people play. With that periscope, you could not watch another person play. Certainly the original version that didn't have the windows cut out. And I thought this could only hurt the ability to gain popularity. And so I said, no, this is a bad idea. And I fought with Morgan about it, but he was the project leader. It was only my second project at Atari. So it went out with the periscope. And later versions did away with it.
Oh, yeah, it's a good point, though. I suppose it catches your eye when you see it, but you're right, you don't actually see the gameplay.
It's better for the player. It brings you in, and I agree with all of that. But what we were always trying to do was increase the coin drop, as we called it.
Sure,
Get more people playing the game. We wanted people to be you'd walk into a popular arcade, and a popular game would have a line of quarters on the console, owned by the people standing in the line to play it next. Well, this would be impossible with the periscope. Yeah. And so it just wasn't. Well, it's also impossible with Battlezone because people were always pulling back on the cabinet and all the quarters would fall off. But
Yeah, I didn't think of that. Oh man, Ed, what a gentleman. I've got one final question. It's a bit of a silly question we ask all our guests, but I've really enjoyed today's interview. If you could share a few drinks with any video game character, who would you choose and why?
Video game character.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the bartender from Tapper. I don't even know if you remember the Tapper game.
I know it. Yeah, I know the game. The beer's flying.
Not for a beer. And that would be the only reason. I don't know. Let's see. Nowadays, I don't even know. And it's not even that recent. How about Lara Croft?
Why not? No, she's a popular choice. She probably gets about a quarter of the votes actually when I ask people. Yeah, no, good. She'll have some interesting stories to tell, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right.
Ed, what a gentleman. Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you. Good luck for the rest of your career and your life. And thank you.
Thank you very much.